The narrow streets of Willowbrook buzzed with the chatter of neighbors, the faint hum of radios, and the occasional barking of dogs. Emily, a 12-year-old with bright eyes and a mind full of dreams, sat on the small porch of her grandmother's weathered home, scribbling furiously in her notebook. She dreamed of becoming a teacher, inspired by her love for books and the hope that education could one day lift her and her grandmother, Martha, out of poverty. But lately, the air in the house felt heavier, shadowed by something unspoken. Martha, a kind woman with silver hair and hands weathered by years of hard work, shuffled into the kitchen. Emily noticed her grandmother's movements had slowed, her once steady hands trembling as she gripped the counter. "Grandma, are you feeling okay?" Emily's voice quivered. Martha waved her off with a soft smile, but her tired eyes told another story. Emily felt a pang of worry deep in her chest, a sense that life as she knew it was about to change. That evening, as Emily laid in bed, she overheard Martha on the phone with a neighbor. "The doctor says it's serious," Martha whispered. "The treatment is expensive. I don't know how we'll manage." Emily's heart sank. She squeezed her eyes shut, gripping her pillow tightly, as if it could shield her from the harsh reality. She couldn't bear the thought of losing Martha, the only family she had ever known. Emily stayed up that night, the silence broken only by the soft creak of the wooden floorboards under Martha's steps. The weight of the situation bore down on her small shoulders. Dreams of teaching faded into the background as a new thought emerged. She would do whatever it took to help her grandmother, no matter the cost. The next morning, Emily skipped breakfast, her appetite replaced by a gnawing anxiety. She walked to school, her steps slow and her thoughts racing. The principal's office loomed ahead, its glass door reflecting the cloudy sky. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. "Emily, what brings you here so early?" asked Mrs. Carter, the principal, a warm yet firm woman who had always admired Emily's dedication. Emily clutched her notebook, her hands trembling. "Mrs. Carter, I need to leave school for a while. My grandma's not well, and I have to help." The words felt heavy as they left her lips, like she was burying a part of herself. Mrs. Carter leaned forward, concern etched on her face. "Emily, you're one of our brightest students. Are you sure this is what you want?" Emily nodded, fighting back tears. "It's not about what I want, it's about what I have to do." The principal sighed, her heart breaking for the young girl. "We'll keep your spot open, Emily. Come back when you can." Walking out of the school gates for what felt like the last time, Emily glanced back at the building that had been her sanctuary. Her friend Sophia called out, running up to her. "Emily, what's going on? Why are you leaving?" Emily hesitated, then hugged Sophia tightly. "I'll explain someday," she whispered, before hurrying away, leaving her friend confused and worried. Emily spent the afternoon wandering the bustling streets, clutching the few coins she had saved. A street vendor caught her eye, selling flowers and candies. "Excuse me, how much to buy a few to resell?" she asked timidly. The vendor, a kind older man, gave her a small bundle. "Take these, pay me back when you can." Grateful, Emily set up her makeshift stand on a quiet corner, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation. The first hour passed with no sales. People rushed by, barely glancing at her small stand. Her stomach growled, but she stayed put, determined. Finally, a woman stopped, buying a small bouquet for her daughter's recital. "Thank you," Emily said, her voice shaking with relief. She counted the coins in her hand. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night, she returned home exhausted. Martha noticed the faint smell of roses clinging to Emily's sweater. "What were you doing out so late, sweetheart?" Martha asked, her voice soft but strained. Emily smiled faintly. "Just helping out." She didn't dare share the full truth, knowing it would upset her grandmother. As Emily lay in bed that night, she stared at the ceiling, her body aching and her mind restless. She knew that selling flowers and candies wouldn't be enough. The mountain she had to climb felt insurmountable, but giving up wasn't an option. She had to save Martha, no matter how impossible it seemed. The narrow streets of Willowbrook hummed with life, from the muffled tunes of old radios to the distant laughter of children playing in alleyways. Emily, a bright-eyed 12-year-old with a boundless imagination, sat cross-legged on the creaky porch of her grandmother Martha's modest home. She clutched her tattered notebook, its pages filled with dreams of becoming a teacher, dreams she believed could one day lift her and Martha out of the struggles of their small world. But as the golden evening light faded, Emily's gaze shifted to the kitchen window. Through it, she saw Martha moving slower than usual, her frail hands trembling as she gripped the sink for support. A pang of worry struck Emily. Something was wrong, though her grandmother had said nothing about it. That night, Emily lay on her worn mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling as shadows danced across the room. Martha's soft footsteps creaked on the wooden floors outside her room, and the sound felt heavier than usual, each step laced with exhaustion. Emily closed her eyes, hoping the heaviness in her heart would dissolve, but instead it grew. From the hallway, she overheard Martha speaking on the phone in a hushed, shaky voice. "The doctor said it's serious. The treatment is costly. I don't know how I'll manage," Martha admitted, her tone resigned. Emily's eyes shot open, her chest tightening. She gripped her thin blanket as fear crept over her. Losing Martha wasn't an option. She was all Emily had in the world. As dawn broke, Emily watched the first rays of light filter through the thin curtains of her room. The air felt different, heavier, more urgent. She sat on the edge of her bed, running her fingers through her tangled hair as she tried to push away the thought that had haunted her all night. Her dreams of becoming a teacher, of studying hard and building a better future, seemed distant now. "It's not about me anymore," she whispered to herself. She knew deep down that she'd have to make sacrifices if she wanted to help Martha, no matter how much it cost her. She stood, resolute, ready to face a world that suddenly seemed much bigger than it had yesterday. The following morning, Emily trudged to school, her steps slow and her head heavy with thoughts she wished she didn't have to think. She passed her classmates, their chatter and laughter feeling like a distant memory she could no longer reach. The principal's office loomed ahead, its frosted glass door catching the pale sunlight. Taking a deep breath, Emily pushed it open and stepped inside. Mrs. Carter, the principal, looked up from her desk, her warm eyes softening when she saw Emily. "Emily, is everything all right?" Mrs. Carter asked, sensing something was wrong. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched her notebook tightly to her chest. I need to leave school for a while," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother's sick and I need to help her." The room fell silent, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Mrs. Carter leaned forward, her expression a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Emily, you're one of our brightest students. Are you sure this is what you want?" she asked gently, hoping to change the young girl's mind. Emily's eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them back and nodded. "It's not about what I want. It's about what I have to do," she replied, her voice steady but heavy with sorrow. Mrs. Carter sighed deeply, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "We'll keep your spot open, Emily. You're always welcome here," she said softly. Emily managed a small, grateful smile before walking out, the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders. As Emily walked out of the school gates, she felt as though she was leaving a part of herself behind. Her classmates waved and called out to her, their voices cheerful and unaware of the storm raging inside her. Her best friend Sophia caught up with her, worry etched on her face. "Emily, where are you going? Why are you leaving?" Sophia asked, grabbing her arm. Emily hesitated, her throat tightening. "I'll explain someday," she said, pulling her friend into a tight hug before turning away quickly, unable to bear the look of confusion and sadness on Sophia's face. Emily walked on, the laughter and chatter of the schoolyard fading behind her, replaced by the quiet determination that had taken root in her heart. That afternoon, Emily wandered the streets of Willowbrook, her small savings jingling softly in her pocket. She passed bustling markets and vendors calling out their wares, their voices blending into the city's steady hum. Her eyes fell on a street vendor selling flowers and candies, the vibrant colors of the blooms catching her attention. She approached him hesitantly, her voice trembling. "Excuse me, sir, how much would it cost to buy a few to resell?" she asked, her words stumbling over themselves. The vendor, an older man with kind eyes, studied her for a moment before handing her a small bundle of flowers. "Take these. Pay me back when you can," he said with a gentle smile. Emily's heart swelled with gratitude as she clutched the bundle to her chest, whispering a soft "thank you" before hurrying off. Emily found a quiet corner near the park and set up her makeshift stand, arranging the flowers as neatly as she could on the cracked wooden crate she had found. She stood there, nervous and unsure, as passers-by barely glanced at her. The first hour felt endless, each second stretching out as she waited for someone, anyone, to stop. Finally, a woman approached, her steps brisk but curious. "How much for the bouquet?" she asked. Emily's voice shook as she replied, $2. The woman smiled, handing over the money and taking the flowers. Emily stared at the coins in her hand, her heart racing. It wasn't much, but it was something. That evening, Emily returned home, her body aching and her pockets barely fuller than when she had left. Martha sat in her worn armchair, her knitting resting in her lap as she watched Emily walk in. "You've been out late, sweetheart. What were you doing?" Martha asked, her voice soft but tinged with concern. Emily hesitated, forcing a smile. "Just helping out," she replied vaguely, not wanting to worry her grandmother. As Emily lay in bed that night, the faint scent of flowers lingering on her sweater, she stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of the day settle over her. Selling flowers wouldn't be enough. She would have to do more, give more. But as overwhelming as it felt, she knew she couldn't stop. For Martha, she would keep going, no matter how hard it got. The morning sun filtered through the cracked window panes of Emily's small room, but its warmth did little to ease the heaviness in her heart. She sat at her desk, staring at her tattered notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting and carefully drawn diagrams. Each word represented a dream she had nurtured, dreams that now felt as fragile as the paper they were written on. Emily took a deep breath and closed the notebook, running her fingers over its worn cover. "I can't hold on to this anymore," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. With a determined expression, she grabbed her backpack and walked out, leaving behind the world of learning and possibility she had once cherished so deeply. The schoolyard buzzed with life as Emily approached the principal's office once more, her steps slow and deliberate. Inside, Mrs. Carter looked up from her desk, her kind eyes filling with sadness when she saw Emily. "Back so soon?" she asked gently, though she already knew the reason for Emily's visit. Emily nodded, her throat tight. "I have to leave for good this time," she said, her voice barely audible. "My grandmother needs me and I can't let her down." Mrs. Carter sighed deeply, leaning back in her chair. "Emily, you have so much potential. Are you sure there's no other way?" she asked, but the determination in Emily's eyes told her everything. "We'll always be here for you," Mrs. Carter added softly, though the words felt hollow to Emily, who knew she might never return. Emily stepped out of the office, the sound of her classmates' laughter and chatter feeling distant and foreign. Her best friend Sophia rushed over, her face etched with concern. "Emily, you can't just leave. What about your dreams? What about everything you've worked for?" Sophia's voice cracked as she spoke, her words tumbling out in desperation. Emily hugged her tightly, holding back tears. "I don't have a choice, Sophia." "My grandma needs me," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Sophia pulled back, searching Emily's face for any sign of doubt, but all she saw was quiet resolve. "Promise me you'll come back," Sophia whispered, and Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure if the promise was one she could keep. By the time Emily returned home, the streets of Willowbrook had grown quieter, the bustle of the morning replaced by the stillness of the afternoon. She sat on the porch, staring at the small pile of coins she had earned selling flowers the day before. It wasn't nearly enough to cover Martha's medications, let alone her hospital visits. But Emily refused to let herself dwell on the enormity of the task ahead. Instead, she made a mental list of what she could sell and where she could find more customers. "One step at a time," she muttered to herself, her voice firm. Inside the house, Martha sat in her favorite armchair, her knitting needles motionless in her lap. Her face lit up when Emily walked in, but her smile faltered when she noticed the tired look in her granddaughter's eyes. "Emily, you've been working too hard," Martha said softly, her voice tinged with worry. Emily shook her head, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Grandma. I just need to figure out a few things," she replied, avoiding Martha's gaze. She didn't want her grandmother to see the fear and exhaustion lurking beneath her determined exterior. That evening, Emily prepared her small collection of candies and flowers for the next day. She carefully arranged them in an old basket she had found in the attic, her hands moving methodically as she fought to keep her emotions in check. Every piece of candy, every flower felt like a step closer to helping Martha, even if the progress was painfully slow. As she worked, she couldn't help but glance at the old bookshelf in the corner, where her school books still sat untouched. A pang of longing shot through her, but she quickly pushed it aside. "There's no time for that now," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the quiet creak of the floorboards. The next day, Emily set up her small stand near the town square, where people bustled by with hurried steps and distracted expressions. She called out softly, her voice trembling with nervousness. "Candies and flowers for sale," she said, hoping to catch someone's attention. Most people walked past without a second glance, their lives too busy to notice the young girl with the hopeful eyes. Emily felt her heart sink, but she refused to give up. She straightened her posture and called out again, louder this time. Finally, a young couple stopped, their arms full of groceries. "How much for the flowers?" the woman asked, her tone kind. $2, Emily replied, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. The woman handed her the money and took the bouquet, smiling warmly. "Good luck, sweetheart," she said before walking away. Emily clutched the coins tightly, a small spark of hope lighting up inside her. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. As the day wore on, Emily sold a few more candies and flowers, each sale bringing a mix of relief and exhaustion. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, she had made enough to buy a small portion of Martha's medication. It wasn't enough to change their situation, but it was a glimmer of progress, a small step forward. When Emily returned home, her body ached and her eyelids felt heavy, but she smiled faintly as she handed Martha the bag of medicine. "We're going to get through this," she said softly, though the uncertainty of her words lingered in the air. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling and allowed herself a moment to dream. She pictured a future where Martha was healthy, where she could return to school and chase her dreams without fear or guilt. The image felt distant, almost impossible, but Emily clung to it like a lifeline. She didn't know how she would make it happen, but she promised herself that she wouldn't stop trying. For Martha, for their future, she would find a way. Emily's days quickly settled into a grueling routine. Each morning, she rose with the sun, her hands already busy arranging the small basket of candies and flowers she would sell. The streets of Willowbrook were her new classroom, and every corner became a station where she learned the harsh lessons of survival. Though the basket grew lighter by the end of each day, her pockets barely reflected the effort. Her feet ached, her voice grew hoarse from calling out to strangers, but Emily didn't let herself stop. Every coin she earned was a small victory, a step closer to keeping Martha alive. But as the days turned into weeks, the strain began to show. Emily's clothes, already worn, became frayed at the edges. Her once bright eyes dulled, shadows gathering beneath them from sleepless nights spent worrying about what tomorrow would bring. Martha noticed the changes and tried to intervene. One evening, she beckoned Emily to sit beside her on the worn sofa. "Sweetheart, you've been working too hard," she said, her voice weak but laced with concern. "This isn't how a young girl should live." Emily shook her head, forcing a small smile. "It's only until we get through this, Grandma," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Martha's health, despite Emily's efforts, continued to decline. Her once vibrant energy was replaced by long hours spent resting in her armchair, her breath shallow and labored. One afternoon, as Emily returned from a long day of selling, she found Martha struggling to stand. "Grandma!" Emily rushed to her side, steadying her frail frame. "I'm fine," Martha insisted, though her trembling hands and pale complexion said otherwise. Emily's heart sank further, the reality of their situation pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't lift. The breaking point came late one evening when Martha's condition worsened dramatically. Emily had just returned home, her feet sore and her arms heavy with the weight of unsold flowers, when she heard a faint call from the bedroom. "Emily!" Martha's voice was barely a whisper. Emily rushed in to find her grandmother slumped against the bed, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Panic seized Emily as she knelt beside her. "Grandma, what's wrong? What do I do?" she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Martha's lips moved, but her words were too faint to hear. Emily didn't wait for answers. She grabbed the phone and dialed the hospital, her hands shaking so badly she could barely press the buttons. "Please, I need help. My grandmother is very sick," she said, her voice cracking with desperation. The operator assured her that an ambulance was on its way, but the minutes felt like hours as Emily waited, holding Martha's hand and whispering words of comfort she wasn't sure she believed. "You're going to be okay, Grandma," she said over and over, her voice trembling. "You have to be." When the ambulance finally arrived, Emily rode beside Martha, clutching her hand as they sped toward the hospital. The sterile white walls and harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room felt cold and unwelcoming, but Emily didn't care. All that mattered was Martha. As the doctors wheeled her away, Emily was left standing in the hallway, her hands balled into fists and her chest tight with worry. She couldn't lose her grandmother. Not now, not ever. Hours passed before a doctor approached Emily, his expression a mix of professionalism and concern. "Are you her granddaughter?" he asked gently. Emily nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "Your grandmother is stable for now, but her condition is serious. She'll need continuous care, including medication and regular checkups. Do you have insurance or any means to cover the costs?" The question hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She shook her head, her voice trembling as she replied, I don't have enough money. I'm trying, but..." The doctor, whose name tag read Dr. Harris, sighed, his expression softening. "We'll do what we can to help," he said. "For now, I can provide some samples of her medication to get started, but you'll need to figure out a long-term plan." Emily nodded, her mind racing as she clutched the small bag of medications he handed her. "Thank you," she whispered, though the words felt insufficient. Dr. Harris hesitated for a moment, then placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're doing a lot for someone your age. That takes courage," he said before walking away. That night, as Emily sat in the dimly lit hospital room, watching Martha sleep, she felt a mix of relief and despair. The immediate crisis had passed, but the mountain ahead felt insurmountable. The coins she earned each day weren't enough, and no amount of determination could change that. She glanced at the bag of medications on the bedside table, a constant reminder of the fight that lay ahead. But as tears threatened to spill, Emily took a deep breath and steadied herself. She couldn't afford to fall apart, not when Martha was counting on her. The days following Martha's hospitalization were a blur of exhaustion and quiet determination for Emily. She spent her mornings by her grandmother's bedside, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest as she slept. The afternoons were a whirlwind of streets and markets, where Emily worked tirelessly to sell her flowers and candies. Her evenings, however, were spent in anxious silence, reviewing hospital bills and calculating how much more she needed to scrape together. It was during one such evening, while gathering laundry from Martha's room, that Emily noticed something unusual. A small, dust-covered chest sat tucked beneath the bed, partially hidden by the folds of a worn quilt. Curiosity piqued, Emily knelt and carefully slid the chest out into the dim light. Its metal latch was rusted, and the wood bore the marks of time. She hesitated, glancing at the door to make sure Martha was still asleep in the next room, then gently pried the lid open. Inside, she found an assortment of yellowed papers and old photographs, their edges frayed. One photo caught her attention. A much younger Martha stood beside a man Emily didn't recognize, both of them smiling in front of what appeared to be a grand country house. Emily's brow furrowed. She'd never heard Martha mention anything about a house like that, or about the man in the photo. As she rifled through the papers, Emily's heart raced. Most were mundane, letters and receipts from decades ago, but one document stood out. It was an official deed for a property listed under Martha's name. Emily's eyes widened as she read the details. The property, located outside of Willowbrook, appeared to be sizable. Could this be the key to solving their financial problems? She didn't know enough to be sure, but the thought filled her with a cautious hope. She carefully packed the papers back into the chest and pushed it under the bed, her mind swirling with questions. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the hospital room's blinds, Emily sat by Martha's bedside, her mind still preoccupied with the discovery. Martha stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Good morning, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice weak but warm. Emily forced a smile, her heart aching at how frail her grandmother had become. "Morning, Grandma. How are you feeling?" she asked, tucking the blanket around Martha's shoulders. Martha waved a hand dismissively. "Don't fuss over me. You're the one running yourself ragged." Emily hesitated, the image of the chest flashing in her mind. "Grandma," she began cautiously, "I found something last night. A chest under your bed. It had old photos and papers in it. There was a deed to some property. Do you know what it is?" Martha's expression changed instantly, her warm smile fading into something guarded and uneasy. "That's old business, Emily. Nothing to worry about," she said firmly, turning her gaze to the window. Emily's stomach tightened. "But Grandma, if it's still in your name, maybe it could help us." "Emily," Martha interrupted, her tone uncharacteristically sharp. "That property is part of a past I left behind for a reason. It's not worth dragging it up again." Her voice softened as she met Emily's gaze. "I know you're trying to help, sweetheart, but some things are better left alone." Emily nodded reluctantly, but the unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that the property might be important, maybe even their lifeline. Later that day, Emily returned to the hospital with a heavy heart. She sat in the waiting area, her hands tightly gripping the strap of her worn satchel. Dr. Harris approached, his kind eyes scanning her face. "How's your grandmother doing today?" he asked, taking a seat beside her. Emily sighed, the weight of her worries making her voice sound small. "She's stable, but it's hard." Dr. Harris nodded empathetically. "You've been carrying a lot on your shoulders, Emily, more than most adults could handle." Something about his words loosened the knot in Emily's chest, and before she knew it, she was blurting out everything about the chest, the deed, and her grandmother's reaction. Dr. Harris listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "A property, you say?" he asked. "That could be significant. Have you looked into it further?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know where to start. Grandma doesn't want to talk about it." Dr. Harris tapped his chin, his mind clearly working. "I might be able to help," he said after a moment. "I have access to some records that might give us more information." Emily's eyes widened. "You'd do that?" she asked, her voice tinged with both hope and hesitation. Dr. Harris smiled. "Of course. Helping people is my job, Emily. Not just with medicine, but however I can." His reassurance gave her a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in days. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. As she watched him walk away, she couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. The hospital was quieter than usual the next morning, the stillness amplifying the sound of Emily's footsteps as she made her way to Martha's room. She carried the chest with her, the weight of its contents feeling heavier than it should. Martha was sitting up in bed, her frail hands folded neatly in her lap. "Good morning, sweetheart," she greeted, her voice soft but steady. Emily set the chest on the small table beside the bed, her gaze earnest. "Grandma, I know you don't want to talk about this, but I think it's important," she began, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. Martha's smile faltered as her eyes flicked to the chest. "Emily, I told you. It's just old memories. It won't help us now," she said, her tone tinged with unease. Emily shook her head, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I don't believe that. If there's even a chance that this property could make things better for us, shouldn't we at least try?" she asked, her voice trembling. Martha sighed, her shoulders sagging. "You don't understand, Emily. That land brought nothing but pain to our family." Emily's heart ached at the sadness in her grandmother's voice, but she couldn't let it go. "Grandma, I don't know what happened back then, but we're struggling now. Maybe this land can be something good for us, something that helps us move forward," she said gently. Martha stared at her for a long moment, her eyes filled with a mix of reluctance and love. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "All right, Emily. If you think it's worth looking into, then do it. But promise me you'll be careful." Emily nodded, a surge of determination filling her chest. "I promise." Later that afternoon, Emily sat in the dimly lit records office, the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Dr. Harris had called ahead, arranging for her to meet with a clerk who could help her dig into the property's details. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Lucy, greeted Emily with a warm smile. "Doctor, Harris told me about your situation," she said, gesturing for Emily to sit. "Let's see what we can find." Lucy's fingers flew across the keyboard, her eyes scanning the screen intently. After a few minutes, Lucy's expression brightened. "Here we go," she said, turning the monitor so Emily could see. A detailed record of the property appeared on the screen, complete with an address and a brief description. "It's a sizable piece of land," Lucy explained. "Looks like it was originally farmland. It's been in your family's name for decades." Emily's eyes widened as she leaned closer. "Is it still in my grandmother's name?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucy nodded. "It is, but it hasn't been maintained, and there are some unpaid taxes. You'll need to handle those before you can do anything with it." Emily's heart sank at the mention of unpaid taxes, but Lucy's next words reignited her hope. "The land has potential value, though. If you can clear up the legal issues, it could be worth quite a bit," she said. Emily nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "How long would it take to sort this out?" she asked. Lucy hesitated. "It depends, but it could take a few months. Maybe longer if there are complications." Emily's stomach churned. She didn't have months, but she thanked Lucy and promised to return soon. As she left the office, clutching a stack of printed documents, she felt a mixture of hope and dread. The land might be their salvation, but the road to claiming it wouldn't be easy. Back at the hospital, Emily sat beside Martha, carefully explaining what she had learned. Martha listened quietly, her expression unreadable. "I don't know, Emily," she said finally, her voice tinged with doubt. "It sounds like a lot of work for something that might not even help us in time." Emily reached for her grandmother's hand, her grip firm. "Grandma, I know it's a risk, but it's worth trying. If there's even a chance that this land could pay for your treatment and help us get back on our feet, then I have to do it." Martha sighed, her gaze drifting to the window. "That land caused so much heartache for our family," she murmured, her voice distant. "Fights over money, over ownership. It tore us apart." Emily frowned, her heart sinking. "Why didn't you ever tell me about it?" she asked softly. Martha shook her head, her expression pained. "I didn't want you to carry the weight of it. I thought it was better left in the past." Emily placed the stack of documents on the bedside table, her resolve unwavering. "Grandma, I'm not afraid of the past. We can face it together, and we can make something good out of it," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. Martha studied her granddaughter for a long moment, her eyes softening. "You're so much braver than I ever was," she said finally, a faint smile breaking through her sadness. "All right, Emily, let's see this through. But promise me you'll take care of yourself too." Emily nodded, tears pricking her eyes. "I promise," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Emily had barely begun navigating the maze of legal processes when the first roadblock appeared. As she walked into the county records office one morning, clutching the documents Lucy had helped her retrieve, her steps faltered at the sight of two unfamiliar faces. A man and a woman, middle-aged and dressed in business casual, stood by the counter talking in hushed tones. Their presence wouldn't have mattered if their voices hadn't carried a name that froze Emily in place. "Martha!" She gripped the strap of her satchel tighter, her heart racing. Who were they, and why were they talking about her grandmother? The answer came quickly, and not in the way Emily hoped. As she approached the counter, the woman turned to her, her sharp eyes narrowing. "You must be Emily," she said, her tone polite but cold. "I'm Teresa, and this is my brother Raymond. We're Martha's cousins." Emily blinked in surprise. She'd never heard of these people before. "Cousins?" she repeated, her voice laced with skepticism. Teresa smiled thinly. "Yes, and we've come to discuss the property. You see, it was part of the family estate, and we're not entirely sure Martha has the sole right to it." The words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. "But the documents say it's in her name," she argued, her voice trembling with both anger and fear. Raymond shrugged, his tone casual but dismissive. "That doesn't mean there aren't other claims to it," he said. "We're just here to make sure everything is handled fairly." Emily stared at them, her mind racing. This was more than a coincidence. They hadn't come out of concern, they had come because they saw an opportunity. Emily stormed out of the records office, her chest tight with frustration. She made her way to the hospital, her thoughts churning as she replayed the encounter in her mind. By the time she reached Martha's room, her emotions threatened to spill over. "Grandma, why didn't you tell me you had other family?" she blurted out, startling Martha from her light nap. Martha's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with guilt. "I didn't think it mattered," she said quietly. "We haven't been in touch for decades. They only cared about that property, not about me." Emily sank into the chair by the bed, her hands trembling. "They're trying to contest it," she said, her voice cracking. "They showed up at the records office today, acting like they have a right to it." Martha sighed, her frail hands twisting in her lap. "I should have known they'd come sniffing around once they found out about it," she murmured. "That land, it caused nothing but arguments and bitterness. I didn't want you to get dragged into it, Emily." "But I'm already in it, Grandma," Emily said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "And I'm not giving up. They can't just take this from us." Martha reached out and squeezed Emily's hand, her grip weak but full of emotion. "You're braver than I ever was, sweetheart," she said softly. "But this won't be easy. They'll fight you every step of the way." Emily nodded, her determination hardening. "Let them try," she said fiercely. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect what's ours." Over the next few days, Emily found herself caught in a whirlwind of legal jargon, conflicting advice, and mounting stress. Dr. Harris, true to his promise, stayed by her side, offering both moral support and practical guidance. "You're going to need a lawyer," he said one evening as they sat in the hospital cafeteria, poring over paperwork. Emily frowned, her hands clasped tightly around a cup of lukewarm tea. "I can't afford one," she admitted. "Everything I have is going toward Grandma's treatment." Dr. Harris nodded thoughtfully, then reached into his pocket and handed Emily a card. "This is a friend of mine," he said. "She specializes in property disputes and works pro bono for families in need. Give her a call. She might be able to help." Emily hesitated, overwhelmed by the kindness she didn't feel she had earned. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Dr. Harris smiled warmly. "You don't have to do this alone, Emily. Remember that." Despite the new glimmer of hope, Emily's challenges didn't stop there. Raymond and Teresa began making public claims about the property, spreading rumors in the small community. That land belongs to the family, not just one person, they argued, their voices reaching even the hospital staff. Emily heard the whispers and saw the sideways glances, but she refused to let them intimidate her. Every night, she sat by Martha's bedside, holding her hand and promising that she wouldn't give up. And every morning, she woke up ready to fight, no matter how daunting the road ahead seemed. The small conference room at the courthouse was cold, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. Emily sat at the long table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across from her sat Raymond and Teresa, their expressions carefully neutral, but their intentions clear. Emily's new lawyer, Ms. Harper, sat beside her, flipping through a thick folder of documents. "This is a preliminary meeting to establish the nature of the dispute," Ms. Harper explained, her tone calm but authoritative. "As the records show, the property has been solely in Martha's name for decades. What claim do you believe you have?" Teresa leaned forward, her lips curling into a practiced smile. "It's not about the documents. It's about fairness," she said smoothly. "That land belonged to the family long before Martha's name was on any deed. We believe we're entitled to a portion of it." Ms. Harper raised an eyebrow. "Entitled," she echoed, her voice sharp. "The law doesn't work on belief. If you have evidence of shared ownership or contributions to the property, now would be the time to present it." Raymond shifted uncomfortably, his confidence faltering under Ms. Harper's steady gaze. We don't have evidence yet," he admitted, his voice hesitant. "But we're looking into it." Emily, who had remained silent until now, couldn't hold back any longer. "This property is the only chance I have to save my grandmother," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You had decades to claim it, and now when we're at our lowest, you show up. That's not fairness, that's greed." Teresa's smile faltered, but she didn't respond. Emily's words hung in the air, a silent declaration that she wasn't going to back down. After the meeting, Emily and Ms. Harper stepped out into the crisp autumn air. Emily exhaled shakily, her breath visible in the chilly breeze. "Did I say too much?" she asked, her voice small. Ms. Harper smiled faintly, her expression reassuring. "You spoke from the heart, Emily. That's never a bad thing," she said. "But we have to stay focused. They're grasping at straws, but that doesn't mean they won't find something to complicate this." Emily nodded, her determination unwavering despite the fatigue settling in her bones. That evening, Emily sat by Martha's hospital bed, recounting the events of the day. Martha listened quietly, her hand resting on Emily's. "You're fighting so hard for me," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "I don't deserve this, Emily." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head fiercely. "Don't say that, Grandma. You're my family. You've always been there for me. Now it's my turn to be there for you," she said, her voice cracking. Martha smiled weakly, her eyes glistening. "You've always had more courage than I ever did, my dear," she murmured. Dr. Harris walked in then, holding a small clipboard. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, his warm smile easing the tension in the room. "Just wanted to check in on you both." Emily managed a small smile, grateful for his presence. "We're doing okay," she said, though the weariness in her voice betrayed her. Dr. Harris nodded, his gaze compassionate. "One day at a time, Emily. You're stronger than you think," he said before leaving the room. His words lingered, a quiet encouragement that Emily held onto as she prepared for the battles still ahead. The following week, Emily's resolve was tested again when Raymond and Teresa filed a formal challenge to the property ownership. Ms. Harper explained the process to Emily in clear terms, but the complexity of the legal jargon left her feeling overwhelmed. "They're trying to argue that the property is part of an unclaimed family trust," Ms. Harper said, her tone calm but serious. "It's a weak argument, but it will slow things down." Emily sighed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "How much longer will this take?" she asked, her voice tight. Ms. Harper hesitated. "If they continue to contest, it could take months. But don't lose hope, Emily. We have the stronger case." Emily nodded, though the weight of the situation pressed down on her. Months felt like an eternity when every day was a struggle to keep Martha's treatment going. She returned to the hospital that evening, her heart heavy, but her resolve intact. As she sat by Martha's bedside, she spoke softly, more to herself than to her grandmother. "They can try to slow me down, but I won't stop. I can't stop." Martha stirred, her eyes opening slowly. "Emily," she murmured, her voice faint, "you don't have to carry all of this alone." Emily blinked back tears, shaking her head. "I'm not alone, Grandma. I have you, and I have people who believe in us. Dr. Harris, Ms. Harper." "Even Sophia checks in when she can," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. Martha's hand tightened around hers. "You have a good heart, Emily. Don't let this fight take that away," she said. Emily nodded, her determination renewed. "I won't, Grandma. I promise." The day of the final court hearing arrived with a crisp chill in the air. Emily stood outside the courthouse, clutching a folder filled with documents Ms. Harper had carefully prepared. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold, and she closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady the storm of emotions within her. Today felt like a crossroads, one where her determination, sacrifice, and courage would be put to the ultimate test. Beside her, Ms. Harper adjusted her glasses and offered a reassuring smile. "We're ready for this, Emily," she said firmly. "Remember, the facts are on our side." Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the judge reviewed the case. Raymond and Teresa sat across the aisle, their lawyer flipping through a thick binder of papers. Emily couldn't help but notice their smug expressions, as if they had already won. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to meet their gaze with unwavering resolve. The judge cleared his throat, silencing the room. "We're here to resolve the matter of property ownership under dispute," he began, his tone even and authoritative. "Let's proceed." Ms. Harper presented their case with precision, outlining the decades-long ownership of the land under Martha's name and the absence of any valid claims from Raymond or Teresa. "The documentation is clear, Your Honor," Ms. Harper concluded. "The property has been legally maintained under Ms. Martha Jenkins for over 40 years without contest. There is no evidence to support the challenger's claim of shared ownership." Emily sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, every word fueling her hope. When it was Raymond and Teresa's turn to speak, their lawyer leaned heavily into the narrative of family entitlement, painting a picture of shared responsibility and communal ownership. "This land was never meant to belong to one person alone," the lawyer argued, his voice smooth but lacking substance. "Our clients believe it should remain within the family as a collective asset." Emily felt anger rise in her chest, but Ms. Harper placed a calming hand on her arm. "Let them talk," she whispered. "They're grasping at straws." As the arguments unfolded, the judge's expression remained unreadable. Emily couldn't tell if he leaned toward fairness or was swayed by the opposing lawyer's emotional appeals. Her pulse quickened as she heard Raymond speak for the first time. "We're not trying to take the land for ourselves," he said, his tone feigning humility. "We just want what's fair for everyone." Emily bit her tongue, knowing the words were far from the truth. The judge finally called for a brief recess to review the evidence. Emily stepped outside, pacing the stone steps of the courthouse. "What if they convince him?" she asked Miss Harper, her voice trembling. Miss Harper shook her head, her expression steady. "They haven't provided any concrete evidence. The law is clear, Emily. Trust the process." Emily nodded, though the weight of uncertainty threatened to crush her. All she could do now was wait. When court resumed, the atmosphere was tense, every eye fixed on the judge as he shuffled his papers. Emily sat on the edge of her seat, her breath caught in her throat. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the arguments, the judge began, his voice echoing in the silent room. It is clear that the property in question has been legally maintained under Ms. Martha Jenkins. There is no basis for the challenger's claims of shared ownership. Emily's heart leapt as the words sank in. She turned to Ms. Harper, who gave her a triumphant nod. Therefore, the judge continued, the property remains under Ms. Jenkins's sole ownership. This case is hereby closed. The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Raymond and Teresa looked stunned, their expressions betraying their defeat. Emily stood, her legs shaky, but her spirits soaring. "We did it," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. As they left the courtroom, Dr. Harris was waiting outside, his face breaking into a wide smile when he saw Emily. "Congratulations," he said warmly. "You've earned this victory." Emily wiped her tears, her gratitude spilling out in a rush. "Thank you for everything. I couldn't have done this without you or Ms. Harper." Dr. Harris nodded, his expression kind. "You've proven how strong you are, Emily, and this is only the beginning." Later that evening, as Emily sat by Martha's bedside, she recounted the day's events, her voice brimming with emotion. "It's ours, Grandma," she said, holding Martha's hand tightly. "The land, it's yours. We did it." Martha smiled weakly, her eyes glistening with tears. "You did it, sweetheart," she murmured. "You fought for something I couldn't. I'm so proud of you." Emily rested her head against Martha's shoulder, her heart finally feeling lighter. For the first time, in what felt like forever, hope glimmered brightly on the horizon. The morning sun streamed through the hospital window, casting a golden glow over the room where Martha sat propped up in her bed. Emily stood by her side, holding a folder filled with documents, the finalized papers confirming the property ownership. "It's all official now, Grandma," Emily said, her voice brimming with a mix of pride and relief. Martha's hands trembled as she reached for the papers, her eyes scanning them with disbelief. "I never thought I'd see the day," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "You've done more than I ever could have dreamed, Emily." Emily knelt by the bed, clasping Martha's hands tightly. "We did this together, Grandma. This is as much your victory as it is mine," she said firmly. Martha smiled, though her eyes glistened with tears. "I just wish I had faced this sooner," she admitted, her gaze drifting toward the window. "Maybe then you wouldn't have had to sacrifice so much." Emily shook her head, her voice steady. "I don't regret a single thing. Everything I did because I love you." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Dr. Harris stepped in, his warm smile lighting up the room. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Not at all, Doctor," Martha said, her smile widening. Emily stood, her gratitude evident in her expression. "We were just talking about next steps," she said, glancing at Dr. Harris. He nodded. "Good timing. I've arranged for a meeting with a local buyer interested in the property. They're willing to purchase it at full market value." Emily's eyes widened. "That could cover everything," she whispered, her heart racing with hope. The meeting took place 2 days later in a small, sunlit office near the outskirts of Willowbrook. Emily and Martha sat across from the buyer, a kind-looking woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Ms. Daniels. "I've been looking for land in this area for a while," Ms. Daniels explained, her tone genuine. "This property has a lot of potential, and I'd like to restore it to its former glory." Emily glanced at Martha, who nodded in quiet agreement. "It's more than we could have hoped for," Martha said softly. As the papers were signed and hands were shaken, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. The money from the sale would not only cover Martha's medical expenses, but also provide a cushion for the future, something Emily hadn't dared to dream of before. "What will you do next?" Ms. Daniels asked, her curiosity genuine. Emily hesitated, her mind drifting to the books she had abandoned and the dreams she had set aside. "I think it's time I go back to school," she said finally, her voice steady with newfound determination. That evening, back at the hospital, Emily shared the news with Sophia over the phone. "You're coming back?" Sophia exclaimed, her excitement bubbling through the line. "That's amazing, Emily. I knew you'd find a way." Emily smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in months. "It feels like a fresh start," she said softly, "for both me and Grandma." Sophia's voice was filled with pride as she replied, "You deserve it, Emily. After everything you've been through, you deserve it all." The day Emily returned to school was one she would never forget. As she walked through the familiar gates, her backpack slung over one shoulder, the world felt different. She noticed things she hadn't before: the chatter of her classmates, the crisp smell of morning air, the sunlight filtering through the trees. Sophia ran up to her, nearly tackling her in a hug. "You're back!" she exclaimed, laughing. "I've been saving a seat for you in class." Emily laughed too, the sound feeling foreign but welcome. "It's good to be back," she said, her voice filled with quiet joy. At the end of the day, Emily stopped by the hospital to share her experience with Martha. "How was it?" Martha asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Emily smiled, sitting beside her grandmother's bed. "It was everything I hoped it would be," she said. "I missed it so much, Grandma, but now I feel like I can finally focus again." Martha reached out, cupping Emily's face in her hands. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. You've been through so much, and yet here you are, stronger than ever." As they sat together, the future no longer felt daunting. Emily could see it clearly now, a life filled with opportunities, built on the foundation of resilience and love. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she also knew she had the strength to face whatever came next. "We've got this, Grandma," she said softly, squeezing Martha's hand. "No matter what, we'll always have each other." Martha smiled, her heart full. "That's all we've ever needed." As the seasons changed and the struggles of the past began to feel more distant, Emily and Martha embraced the new life they had built together. The funds from the property sale not only secured Martha's medical treatment, but also allowed Emily to focus fully on her education. Her days were now filled with books and classrooms, her heart rekindling its love for learning. The dreams she had once set aside now felt closer, more attainable. Martha, too, found her strength returning little by little. The treatments Dr. Harris had recommended were working, and she spent her afternoons knitting by the window, watching the world outside with a renewed sense of peace. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," she often said, her voice filled with gratitude. "But you made it happen, Emily. You gave us this chance." Their story, once defined by hardship and sacrifice, had become one of resilience and hope. The bond between grandmother and granddaughter, tested by life's trials, had emerged stronger than ever. They carried with them the lessons of their journey, of love, perseverance, and the courage to face the unknown. And as Emily sat at her desk one evening, her notebook open and her pen poised, she smiled at the blank page before her. This time, the future didn't feel like a distant dream. It felt like a promise she had made to herself and to the woman who had been her greatest source of inspiration. As the seasons changed and the struggles of the past began to feel more distant, Emily and Martha embraced the new life they had built together. The funds from the property sale not only secured Martha's medical treatment, but also allowed Emily to focus fully on her education. Her days were now filled with books and classrooms, her heart rekindling its love for learning. The dreams she had once set aside now felt closer, more attainable. Martha, too, found her strength returning little by little. The treatments Dr. Harris had recommended were working, and she spent her afternoons knitting by the window, watching the world outside with a renewed sense of peace. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," she often said, her voice filled with gratitude. "But you made it happen, Emily. You gave us this chance." Their story, once defined by hardship and sacrifice, had become one of resilience and hope. The bond between grandmother and granddaughter, tested by life's trials, had emerged stronger than ever. They carried with them the lessons of their journey, of love, perseverance, and the courage to face the unknown. And as Emily sat at her desk one evening, her notebook open and her pen poised, she smiled at the blank page before her. This time, the future didn't feel like a distant dream. It felt like a promise she had made to herself and to the woman who had been her greatest source of inspiration. This story reminds us of the power of love, courage, and determination in the face of adversity. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to make a difficult sacrifice for someone you loved? How did it shape your journey? If Emily and Martha's story touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another tale of hope and resilience. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that no matter how tough life gets, there's always a path forward.